obvious. There's a big debate starting in the business world around whether it is better for a business to be listed on an exchange like, the JSE, or for them to delist. At the moment, a company that's listed on the JSE or a stock exchange in London or New York or Hong Kong or wherever has to comply with certain reporting requirements. So, if you're the CEO of a company listed on the JSE, you know that your salary will be published and your next door neighbor and your spouse will know how much money you make. If you're a company that's not listed on the stock exchange, well, then you don't have to report quite so much information. It may lead to a bit more domestic harmony. So then, which is better? And why are some companies looking at delisting? Rob Rose is the editor of the Financial Mail magazine. Rob, good afternoon to you. Firstly, why do some companies decide to list on a stock exchange and some companies decide not to?
Afternoon, Stephen. Well, the primary reason that somebody lists on a stock exchange is to raise money. You get public shareholders and you get capital from the stock markets, which you then use to expand or do whatever you want. But at the moment, there's this big fight back against listing on stock exchanges. People don't like you said, the disclosure requirements around remuneration, for example. And so they're raising money from private funds, from private equity and other ways of doing it, which is, for directors who don't like their salaries being published, it's a much easier way to do things.
So in other words, if you and I know each other, and you're the editor of Financial Mail, so you'll be the one with the money. If I were wanting to expand my company, I would delist and I'd come to you and I'd say, Rob, we know each other. Can I please have some money? I'll make you a shareholder. I'll give you 20% of the company. You become a shareholder. We do what happens on the JSE. It's just not public.
Exactly. Leave aside the fact that we as journalists, we're unlikely to be dealing with massive amounts of money ever at any stage. The point is that, that's exactly it. Private equity has become all the rage, and there's far less transparency, far less focus on what happens in private equity circles, and there's more money in that realm. So why expose yourself to the scrutiny of the public? Why have people complain about your 300 million rand salary, as recently happened with Neil Froneman and Sibanye, if you can do it all in private and earn a lot more money and not have the big fuss happening with the labour unions when they see your salary in the headlines?
I was fairly certain Neil Froneman was going to arrive in this conversation somehow. There's then an issue called dual-class share structures. So the way my simple journalistic mind works is that if I buy one share, I have the same right as anyone else who buys one share. If someone buys 30% of the shares and I only have one share, well, they have more shares, but each of our shares is still worth the same amount. A dual-class share is different. How does that work?
Yeah, so if you think of it in terms of shareholder democracy, one share should be equal to one vote. But that doesn't happen in a lot of companies. They've put in place these mechanisms to protect themselves. So in political terms, it would be the same as, say, the ANC reckoning that they were the founders of the organization, the ANC top six, and therefore they should have 100 times, their one vote should count for 100 times the vote of the guy on the street. So that's ultimately what it is. It's an unequal way of doing things. And it's to protect you from being voted out by angry shareholders, for example. So if you run a company badly, the normal way it works is you should be voted out of your seat. But if you have a situation where you have 1,000 times the voting power of someone else, you can hold on to that and you can entrench yourself and protect yourself from hostile takeovers, from being booted out, from being asked awkward questions at AGMs by angry shareholders.
So an example of this that's happened in our lifetime is, I think, Alphabet, the people who own Google. So a group of people formed the company. They realized how valuable it would be. They gave themselves special shares, so special voting rights. No matter what you do, no matter how much money you and I manage to cobble together, we'll never have the rights that they do in Google.
Absolutely, and it speaks to the arrogance, extreme arrogance and egotism of a lot of companies, that they, the founders, are the sole ones who can run the company, and they deserve way more shareholder rights than someone else. And the thing is, people still invest in these companies despite that, because they think, well, if I invest in Google, I'm going to make massive amounts of returns. But it's a fairly unequal way of doing things, and that's why stock exchanges globally had stopped this practice of dual share structures. But now, because the JSE has lost a lot of shares now, they've decided, a lot of companies have delisted, they've decided to repeal that and go back to a situation where they will allow dual-class structures to list. And this is in line with the London Stock Exchange and other exchanges around the world who are also desperate for business, so are making these compromises that they wouldn't have done 10 years ago, for example.
Why are companies suddenly doing this? I mean, what changed in the last 10 years?
Well, for the JSE and for the London Stock Exchange and various others, it's the fact that companies have decided to list on exchanges across the world in a globalized economy. that makes it easier for them. So they'll choose to go to America, for example, where you won't have any complaints about a dual class shareholder system. And guys like the LSE or the Joburg Stock Exchange realizes that they're losing out on the business. So they think, well, let's relax our rules slightly and relax our governance criteria, and perhaps we'll get more business. We'll have more companies listed on our exchange. Because the fact is, Stephen, the JSE has probably half the number of companies it had 10, 20 years ago on the exchange. So in a desperate bid to get more business, they're looking at relaxing the controls.
Which is worse? I realize I'm asking you an impossible question, but if companies delist, lose the transparency, you and I won't know how much each of their CEOs earn, and frankly, Rob, that would sadden me deeply. But there is an important argument around transparency here. So that would be a bad thing. But it seems to me that, any kind of situation where one vote or one share is worth more than another vote or another share is also a bad thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that a situation where you have a stock exchange and you have the transparency of that, it allows us insight into the corporate world. And as we've seen, Stephen, as you know, there's been many shenanigans in the private sector over the past 15 years. And had that all been private, we wouldn't have known any better. We wouldn't have seen that corporate governance isn't quite all it's cracked up to be, which will allow us to have a greater insight into what's going on. So it'd be bad if we lost all of those things. And I think that the point is that shareholders and big institutions, it's your pension fund money that is invested in these things. It's up to those shareholders who manage your pension fund money to say, let's keep governance standards where they are. Let's not repeal this.
So, would an example of that be perhaps Tongaat Hewlett? Because it's such a big company, there's been so much going on within it. Because it's listed, it all has to come out. It might have stayed hidden for longer otherwise. Absolutely.
And the amount of stories you hear that happens behind closed doors because these companies are not listed on the stock exchange, it'd be very bad if that kind of thing was kept private. The amount of corruption and crime. I think we've learned over the past 20 years or so that focusing sunlight on these issues makes them a lot easier to handle, digest, and society can process what's happening and hopefully put in place the safeguards to stop it happening again. If this is all happening behind closed doors, we don't know quite how bad it is. It makes it much harder to deal with the fractures in our social fabric.
Rob Rose, thank you very much indeed. Editor at Financial Mail. Do appreciate the time.